I mean to tell you all that if you asked me to tell you what is the biggest reality we now have to face, it's the end of the American empire. What we inherited from the British, because they had the last empire before this one, is now over, and there is zero chance it's coming back. That inequality, together with the inflation, gives you Mr. Trump's victory and the bitterness and divisiveness that is suffusing this economy. And still, nobody willing to face these realities or to speak about them.
We are living through a rapidly evolving global economy. The U.S.'s dominance since 1945 is now coming to an end, making way for the emergence of a new, multipolar world. Richard Wolff, emeritus professor of economics at the University of Massachusetts Amherst, points out that the United States faces a serious economic competitor for the first time in over a century. Since World War II, the U.S. has been an unmatched economic superpower, with no other nation able to challenge its dominance. This period of U.S. supremacy aligned with the decline of the British Empire, and American power grew throughout the 19th and 20th centuries. The U.S. peaked from 1945 to 2010, with the Soviet Union presenting some political and military challenges, but never a real economic threat. The Cold War, often seen as a competition between two superpowers, was largely one-sided, with the U.S. poised to win. The aftermath of World War II, which devastated potential economic rivals and saw Europe lose its colonies, left the U.S. with a unique position in global trade and investment. Despite this, many refuse to believe that this dominance wouldn't last forever, and that same denial continues today, even as the reality of decline becomes undeniable. The U.S. has struggled militarily in recent decades, failing to achieve victory in conflicts such as the Korean War, Vietnam War, and the wars in Afghanistan and Iraq. The NATO alliance, while powerful, proved insufficient to change the outcomes of these wars. More recently, U.S. military and financial support for Ukraine, along with aggressive sanctions against Russia, have failed to achieve their intended results. The decline of the U.S. empire is also evident in trade finance and investment. One clear indicator is the diminishing role of the U.S. dollar as the world's primary reserve currency. Its use in global trade, loans, and investments is also shrinking as countries seek alternatives. The once dominant dollar-denominated assets, widely regarded as a stable store of wealth, are losing their appeal. We will present clips from Richard's interview, but before we do, please give this video a thumbs up, subscribe to the channel, and turn on the notifications bell for more videos on silver and other precious metals. Thanks for the support, and enjoy the video.
I mean to tell you all that if you asked me to tell you what is the biggest reality we now have to face, it's the end of the American empire. What we inherited from the British, because they had the last empire before this one, is now over, and there is zero chance it's coming back. It ought to have been a central issue in the presidential election we just had. Instead, the two candidates and their parties worked overtime to practice denial. No such a thing. The war in Ukraine, just to take one of countless examples, will show you how costly this denial is. When the war begins in February of 2022, President Biden told us, along with all of his officials, Russia would be brought to its knees. The Russian currency, the ruble, would collapse. The entire West would side with Ukraine against the Russian invasion and would defeat the Russians. None of that happened. Every part of that prediction proved false. Why? Because the way Russia was to be brought to its knees was by denying the market for Russian oil and gas, whose export the Russians depend on. It's a major industry for them. And they exported all of that energy to Western Europe. When the Western Europeans, under pressure from the United States, closed their markets to Russia, the expectation was that Russia would collapse. Instead, Russia went to its allies in the BRICS, above all China and India, and arranged to sell to them the oil and gas they no longer sold to the Europeans. As a result, Russia is growing faster this year than the United States, and it has grown at a faster rate than the United States throughout the war. You couldn't be more mistaken than this. That's what it means if you deny a reality. All right, let me tell you the next step of this because it drives home the point. What we know about the history of every other empire that also grew, was powerful, and then died was that the ride up as you're growing is a lot more fun and pleasant than the ride down when you're dying. The ride up was the 20th century, which many of you, like me, lived through. We now have to figure out how we descend when our empire is dying. What the United States is doing is typical. Denial has always been there. You can travel to Britain today and encounter no small number of people who still imagine that the British Empire is still there. Witness the inauguration ceremonies for King Charles, who's the king of nobody. What is this? Here's how it works in the United States. People who are rich and powerful are offloading the costs of a declining empire off of themselves. They don't want to suffer, which I understand. But if the economy is going down, which it is, and the people at the top are keeping theirs, which they are, then the rest of us, the middle class, the lower classes, the poor, we're going to be taking it on the chin more and more. And let me give you just a few of the examples. The inflation we just went through. That's a way of lowering the standard of living of large numbers of people, which they felt acutely as they went and paid $6 for a dozen eggs or everything else. They know they're suffering. My guess, no chance for Mr. Trump without that inflation. It gave him the victory, and it cost Kamala Harris the loss. But it's not the only thing. Let me give you other examples which an economist stares at with astonishment. The minimum wage at the federal level in the United States right now is $7.25 per hour, a sum of money on which nobody can live. When was the last time it was raised? 2009. That's 15 years ago. In every one of those 15 years, inflation raised the prices here in the United States of food, clothing, shelter, and everything else. Some years it went up a lot. Some years it went up only a little, but it went up. And what did we do to the people to whom we paid the lowest salary, $7.25? We didn't raise it. Republicans didn't raise it. Democrats didn't raise it. You know what that is? That's cruel and unusual punishment given to people whose crime is that they're poorly paid in the first place. What kind of a country does that? A declining empire whose rich and powerful are busy offloading the costs of that decline onto everybody else. Here's another sign. Our real wages have been stagnant for 30 to 40 years. In other words, if you measure, as we do in economics, the average wage in dollars paid to American workers, and you adjust that to the prices they have to pay when they spend their wages, it's been going up somewhere around 0.5% a year. That's called stagnation. That means your wage isn't going anywhere. By the way, in contrast, the average real wages in the People's Republic of China have quadrupled over the same 30 years. If you want to understand why the government in China is secure, why it is powerful, why economic growth there is celebrated, I just gave you the statistic. Their average wage quadrupled. The average wage in the United States went nowhere. That's not even close, friends. And if you didn't know that, since everything I'm telling you is easily verifiable in 1,000 government statistics, then you understand what I mean by denial. We are therefore experiencing in this country an extraordinary deepening of inequality.
The economic decline in the United States is becoming increasingly apparent as the wealthiest individuals continue to shift the burden of this decline onto the rest of society, particularly the middle and lower classes. The federal minimum wage, stagnant at $7.25 an hour since 2009, exemplifies this failure. Despite the rising living costs, wages have barely budged, making it harder for workers to support themselves. Inflation has only exacerbated this, with essential expenses like housing and healthcare becoming more expensive while wages remain stagnant. Meanwhile, the top 10% of earners continue to increase their wealth, widening the gap between the rich and everyone else. This growing inequality is leaving many people behind, with no end in sight, and threatening the very foundation of the country's economy. Richard Wolff explains that Donald Trump's rise to power is closely tied to many Americans' economic difficulties in recent years. As the gap between the rich and the poor widened, with the wealthiest getting even wealthier while ordinary people struggled, Trump recognized the growing fear and frustration. He presented himself as a protector, promising actions like building a border wall and imposing tariffs on China to offer security, even though these solutions were mostly symbolic and economically flawed. While they resonated with people feeling powerless, Wolff points out that Trump's policies didn't address the real issues, such as wage stagnation and the decline of the working class, and instead served as distractions from deeper economic problems.
At the end of World War II, the United States was less unequal than European countries. Today, we are more unequal than every European country. How did that happen? Well, on the one hand, when corporations went to China and took advantage of low wages and a growing market, it made a fortune for those corporations and therefore for the top 10% of Americans who own shares. Just a footnote. The top 10% richest Americans own 80% of the stocks and bonds. They did well. The rest of us, we are experiencing a declining empire, which those at the top don't want you to think about. They're managing it quite well. We cannot. That inequality, together with the inflation, gives you Mr. Trump's victory and the bitterness and divisiveness that is suffusing this economy. And still, nobody willing to face these realities or to speak about them. Let me conclude by telling you that this is important to understand not only as our past and not even only as our present, as in the election we just had, but also in our future. This denial, this refusal to face the realities of the economy we have and that is shaping our lives and even more those of our children, promises us frightening near future. Mr. Trump won the election because he positioned himself with dramatic gestures, the sort favored by Madison Avenue advertisers. And the two gestures were, I am the great protector. Mr. Trump understood far better than the Democrat that people feel attacked, undermined, frightened, scared, worried for themselves and their children, as well they should be. They glimpse fearfully where things are going. They want to be protected from it all. So he put himself forward as the great protector. And his two images were walls, the image of a protector. He's going to put a steel wall at the southern border to protect us against the invasion of the immigrants. And then he's going to put another wall, a tariff wall, to protect us against the evil Chinese. Very powerful images, very successful. But in terms of economics, total incoherent nonsense. Let me explain, and then I will conclude. We have 10 to 12 million undocumented immigrants. That's according to the Department of Homeland Security. We are a population of 330 million Americans. Do the math. 10 to 12 of the poorest people in the country, those immigrants, are not the explanation for the economic difficulties of this rich country of 330 million people. The very idea of that is ridiculous. An undergraduate who wrote such a thing would be called in by their teacher and told, try to think through what you're saying before you say it. The real economic problems, and they are real, of the United States have to do with what I just spent 20 minutes going over with you. They don't depend on more or less immigrants. On the other hand, if Mr. Trump now deports 5 or 10 of these 10 to 12 million immigrants, which he has threatened to do, there will be consequences. Why? Because undocumented immigrants are the most abused of our working class. An undocumented immigrant who asks for his pay on Friday afternoon and is told by his employer, sorry, I don't have the money, has no recourse. He can't go to the police. He's an undocumented immigrant. He doesn't want to get anywhere near any office of the government. He will not complain. He can't. He's like a slave. And that's how they're treated. The construction industry in this country is a major employer. If it doesn't have undocumented employees, it'll have to pay Americans. And you know what? It'll have to pay them a hell of a lot more than they're paying the terrified, undocumented immigrant. And that will mean the cost of construction will zoom up. And you know what that does? It worsens our inflation. Mr. Trump either can't do it for that reason, or he will produce an inflation that will overnight turn him from savior to demon in the eyes of his own followers. Then there's the second wall, the tariff wall. Let me remind everyone what a tariff is. It's just a tax. It's the name given to a particular kind of tax, namely the tax charged to an American importer when that person brings something produced overseas into the United States to be sold. It means Mr. Trump, a Republican who is against taxes, is proposing an enormous tax increase. And while he keeps saying he's hitting the Chinese with a tariff, It's not the Chinese who pay for tariffs. It's Americans. The American importer will pay much more. And that person will then charge more to the consumer, you and me. And you know what that means? An inflation, which he can't have. Yet he proposes these, counting on the American people to be into denial, not to interrogate any of this, to sit there and have debates as if there's something to debate. The debate is a distraction. It's a way of not dealing with your problem because you're too frightened of letting it be debated, lest it go where it might bite you. And we are run by a community of businessmen and women in charge of our corporations, including our mass media, who are not going to do it. Mr. Trump's economic proposals, whatever else you think of them, are economically incoherent. It's great advertising. I'm protecting you with my walls. It's wonderful. But when it comes now to governing, it's impossible, and it's a bad joke. And the whole world is watching.
Gold is often seen as a safe investment, especially during economic uncertainty. For gold investors, Trump's presidency could bring both risks and opportunities. In early 2024, inflation drove up gold prices as investors sought a hedge against rising costs. However, as inflation eased and interest rates increased, gold's price growth slowed. Despite this, gold remains a favored choice for those looking to protect their wealth in uncertain times. Historically, gold prices rose during Trump's presidency, which has continued under the Biden administration. As of now, gold prices remain high. If Trump's presidency leads to aggressive spending or significant trade reforms, it could increase demand for gold again, potentially driving prices higher. That's it for today. If you found this message compelling and enjoyed the video, be sure to give it a thumbs up, share it with others, subscribe to our channel, and turn on post notifications for more thought-provoking content. Thanks for watching.